Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Uni4Me live session. My name is Martin Webster. As you probably are aware, Uni4Me is a website which has lots of online activities that you can access for free around various different subjects, around applying to higher education, around why you should go to higher education. And we're delighted today to be joined by Dr. Christopher Vaughan. And Christopher is a history lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University. We're then going to have some input from a recent graduate from Amity University who studied history, around why you should study history. But first I'm going to hand over to Christopher now for his presentation.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Martin. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to talk about a subject which is close to my heart in terms of my research and also my teaching specialisms. And that is basically the history of Africa during the period of European and today specifically British colonialism. I'm aware that the British Empire is a subject that you can cover as part of the A-level syllabus. But I don't know of any A-level modules that teach African history specifically from the perspective of Africans themselves. And that's very much what I do at John Moores, and many colleagues of mine across the UK who deliver African history modules at undergraduate level are often introducing students to this area of work for the first time. If you've encountered Africa at all in your education before university, it will probably be through the lens of the British Empire. But actually African history itself as a subject, it's often a new area for our undergraduates and one that they find often to be very exciting and surprising in many ways. Some of what I'll say will be familiar to you, I would have thought, perhaps other bits of it, perhaps less so, but certainly I'd like to kind of give you a flavour of the sort of things that I sort of try to teach at undergraduate level. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I've got here a slideshow to walk you through. Bear with me, I'm just going to try and get that going. There we are. Hopefully you can see what I'm seeing. As I've said, the aim of this really is to make you think about the role of Africans in the British Empire. Often we talk about the history of imperialism through a lens of kind of conflicts of one kind or another, that is kind of European or British kind of domination, and then African kind of resistance, and the eventual end of empire, and the kind of victory of African nationalism. But I think you may also know that the British Empire was a very ramshackle system. There were very few British people who actually ran the empire really on the ground, and to a considerable extent the British Empire in Africa and elsewhere rested on the participation in different ways of many different African peoples and people. That participation wasn't always voluntary. It was sometimes forced or coerced. But there are also ways in which kind of Africans seized on opportunities, often unintended opportunities that British imperialism and European imperialism more generally presented to them. The image here is of African policemen who worked for the colonial state in South Africa in the early 20th century. Imperial police forces, imperial armies in Africa were usually made up of African recruits or conscripts. Okay, so one of the ways that I try to get students to think about colonialism in Africa is to think about it as a kind of a co-production between Europeans, the British, and Africans. It's not an equal encounter by any stretch of the imagination. Imperialism is always a project of domination at bottom, but it's also clear that Africans played a crucial role in making this system. And how did they experience imperialism? How did Africans live through imperialism? What were the sort of social impacts of imperialism in Africa, as well as the kind of larger political story that you may be more familiar with? Those sorts of questions I think are really very interesting indeed. And to some extent what I'm talking to you about is a perennial question that emerges in many fields of study in the historical discipline. And that's a question basically about the kind of tension between what scholars call structure on the one hand and agency on the other. That is, to what extent are people's lives shaped by wider structures over which they have little control, structures like imperialism and colonialism? Or to what extent do people actually shape their own histories, either collectively or individually, in response to those larger structures? To what extent can people shape those larger structures, resist those structures, turn them to their own advantage? So that sort of big debate, and it is a big perennial debate in the social sciences more generally, indeed, around, how is history made? How do people live? Within these kind of larger political and economic structures, how much space do people have to shape their own histories? To what extent did Africans make their own histories, or to what extent were they kind of, victims, if you like, of an oppressive imperial system? So those are the sorts of things that I just want to kind of briefly kind of take you through. As I said, my own research field has been in the field of African history, and specifically, I worked, my early research was on the history of British rule in Sudan, a very large territory, now country in Northeast Africa, ruled by the British in the early 20th century. And one of the most striking things that I found evidence of in colonial documents was the prevalence of the use of violence as a tool of colonial control. That should really surprise nobody. But then on the other hand, it's still quite surprising to read about it so explicitly, and to see how openly colonial officials reported incidences of extreme violence as if it was normal, because to them it was normal. That was an everyday part of the way that colonial governance worked. So this, the quote that I've put up on the screen here is taken from a report written by a particular British official stationed in Western Sudan in the early 20th century. He talks here about burning down the villages of Africans. He talks here about shooting at people who were running away from his policemen and himself. And he talks about how, unfortunately, there were no results of that shooting owing to long range. So here, British colonialism in a fairly remote part of Sudan is very clearly a system which is absolutely, in which violence is absolutely integral and absolutely central part of what is going on. And it's a kind of violence that, of course, nowadays would be kind of, shocking to us. But as I say, in the early 20th century was regarded as very normal by British officials in Africa. Similarly, and I apologize for if this shocks you, but here is, this is kind of private writing by a British official also stationed in Sudan, talking about a particular ethnic group in Sudan that the British governed. And he talks about them, as you can see here, in pretty horrific language, and indeed uses the kind of language that we would usually associate with Nazism and fascism, kind of exterminationist language that we wouldn't really usually want to imagine that the British Empire kind of used. And I'm not saying that there was no exterminationist project in the Sudan, but it's nonetheless very interesting to see the ease with which colonial officials would talk about those sorts of ideas, and the idea that particular groups of people perhaps did not actually deserve to exist. So again, here an example of the embedded racism of colonial rule, which once again is kind of undeniable, but again, sometimes we'd kind of, we'd rather not kind of think about it so much. So, I think probably me saying these things is kind of, telling you things that you probably already know. That is that, imperialism in Africa was racist and violent. That really should be of no surprise to anybody by now. I think you'll also be aware that, of course, the process of colonization and conquest was one that was often resisted very vigorously by African peoples keen to maintain their own independence and to resist their subjugation by colonizers. One of the most famous examples being that pictured here at the end of the 19th century in what becomes known as Zimbabwe, what was then known as Rhodesia, an episode known as the Chimurenga, where basically multiple ethnic groups in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, rose up against British control. They laid siege to the central city of British colonialism for several months. They burnt down farms owned by European settlers. They attacked mines, burnt mines, considerable kind of damage inflicted on British colonialism in the region, before finally being crushed by British troops actually sent up from South Africa to deal with that resistance. And time and again, you'll see these episodes of resistance basically crushed by superior European military technology employed in a very ruthless fashion against, as I say, very vigorous resistance mounted by African peoples. So that narrative of conquest and resistance is probably quite familiar to you, as I say, if you've looked at this history at all to date. You may or may not also be aware, another way of thinking about colonialism is not simply as Europeans inflicting violence and domination on Africans, but as I already suggested at the beginning, a more subtle and kind of interesting story, whereby, Europeans, the British here particularly, needed Africans to work with them on the ground in order to make this ramshackle structure of imperialism work. It was all very well showing up with the machine guns and demonstrating that you could crush resistance, but actually getting stuff done, actually governing territory and peoples, collecting taxes, maintaining law and order and all that sort of stuff, well, there simply weren't enough British officials in Africa to do that. And moreover, of course, they had no legitimacy amongst the Africans that they ruled. They had very little understanding of the societies that they ruled. So the British very much depended on African intermediaries of many kinds to do the business of actual, if you like, day-to-day government and administration. And one of the most kind of famous examples of this reliance on local intermediaries is the policy of indirect rule, as it was followed in Africa. That is the idea that Britain would rule indirectly through established African elites, established African rulers, chiefs, whatever you want to call them, so the people who the British believed to have traditional authority in the societies that they governed. So the image on the left there, Frederick Lugard, Lieutenant Governor of Nigeria, standing with the emirs, the Muslim princes of northern Nigeria. The image is a kind of propaganda, but it does also kind of capture this idea that British imperialism in Africa was a kind of, a jointly run endeavor. And these African elites were absolutely central to the structures of imperial rule. The image on the right, a series of chiefs being rewarded with medals and robes by British officials for their loyalty. This is actually an image captured of chiefs who had taken part in the repression of a rebellion in Sudan in the early 20th century. So when the British went out to crush resistance, they often rode out with African troops alongside them, raised by African chiefs who were, for whatever reason, casting in their lot with the British state. So again, imperialism presented opportunities to African elites, opportunities to cement their power and authority in partnership with British officials. And there is a whole kind of historiography, a whole debate, if you like, in African history around the role of those chiefs. Some historians see chiefs as kind of collaborators with imperialism, people who betrayed their own people and became very authoritarian kind of tyrants at a local level. Others see chiefs in a more complex light, recognizing that they basically were trying to have to keep colonial governments happy, whilst also still trying to keep an eye on their legitimacy amongst their own people. They couldn't completely alienate the people that they governed over. They couldn't simply kind of carry out all the orders of the colonialists, because if they did so, they would lose that kind of local legitimacy. So the person of the chief is a really interesting figure in African history and in the history of empire, sort of mediating between the world of empire and the world of kind of the African societies that empire kind of tried to control. And the chief really plays a crucial role in those sorts of structures. it's men on both sides, of course, as well. It's elite men, British and African on both sides. When it comes to economic structures, again, we can kind of make similar sorts of points and point to similar sorts of discussions and sort of debates, I guess, in the field. One way to think about colonial economic policy in Africa is to see it as highly exploitative. And of course, that would be entirely correct. Europeans, where they invested capital in Africa, did so for their own profit. So the mines of Central and Southern Africa being one obvious example pictured there on the right. And also you may be familiar with the idea that a number of Europeans, a number of British people came to Africa and basically were given large amounts of land by colonial governments to farm as a sort of large scale commercial venture. Often those lands were seized from Africans themselves. So Africans saw their lands basically stolen and given to Europeans to farm for profit, driving Africans off that often very fertile land and driving them into much poorer, less fertile areas where they would struggle basically to eke out a sustainable livelihood. And European enterprises in colonial Africa, be those agricultural enterprises or industrial mining enterprises, always depended on African labor. African labor was absolutely central to colonial economies. They couldn't function without African labor. And one of the sort of most prominent features of colonial Africa in terms of its social history is the movement of often young men from rural areas, from their rural homes to areas where they could find work, be that a European farm or be that a kind of mining industrial center, where they could basically earn cash to pay taxes to colonial governments. And again, this is often cast as a story of exploitation. Workers in colonial Africa were paid very poorly. They lived in terrible conditions. They worked in terrible and unsafe conditions. They were very much kind of, abused by European seniors. It was a very kind of, in a way, a very violent system of labor exploitation again. But equally, as we can tell a story of exploitation, we can also tell a story about African kind of entrepreneurship and kind of the attempt to kind of seize the sort of opportunities that existed, even in this highly exploitative structure. And there were kind of regional differences to some extent as well that we should take into account. Where Europeans did not seize land in Africa, then African economies created much more opportunity for African peasant farmers, who still basically lived on their own land, who were still able to kind of farm their own land. And for instance, in West Africa, where European settlement was much less than in Eastern or Southern Africa, then it was more possible for African peasant farmers to engage with the kind of global trading opportunities that colonialism presented to them. Again, I'm simplifying somewhat. It's still a system which kind of benefits Europeans more than Africans. But nonetheless, for instance, the cocoa economy pictured here, still a vibrant economy in West Africa today, in Ghana especially, what used to be known as the Gold Coast in the colonial period. This is an economy which rested and rests very much on, the entrepreneurship of African farmers who seized on the opportunity to earn wealth by interaction with colonial economic structures. Notably, it wasn't just men who wanted to engage in the colonial economy. Women in colonial Ghana, in the Gold Coast, increasingly demanded from their husbands their own land, their own farms that they could farm for their own profit. Women saw opportunities in the colonial economy and wanted to seize on those. Women might also seize on other kinds of opportunities that the colonial economy presented. The growth of urban areas, the growth of industrial urban areas meant that a workforce working down the mines needed feeding and needed refreshment. So beer brewing, for instance, became a very profitable occupation for women who were willing to move to urban areas and to set up basically their own, independent kind of trading business, or the trade in foodstuffs indeed as well, selling food at the market. So I suppose what I'm getting at here is that colonial economic structures were very exploitative. They were loaded in the interest of Europeans themselves, of course, but also that we see Africans in numerous ways kind of trying to exploit those economic structures to their own profit and to their own benefit. The image on the right here, the black and white image, is actually of what the British called a native court. And it should be said that African men and British officials were both often quite anxious about the way in which African women were demanding and gaining more independence from their fathers or from their husbands because of the economic changes unleashed by colonialism. You know, colonial officials, British colonial officials, did not want to disrupt traditional gender roles. They wanted women very much to stay in their place in terms of performing labour on family farms and looking after children and so on and so forth. And so they actually set up this system of native courts to sort of oversee what they often claim to be sort of traditional local law, traditional African custom. But in reality, these courts are often used as a way to punish women who were too assertive of their own freedoms, who were walking out on their husbands, for instance, when they weren't getting what they expected, or women who eloped, who ran away with a man of their choice rather than respecting the authority of their fathers. So colonial states and, as I say, African men, and especially older African men, were worried about a kind of crisis in gender roles, and particularly also the behavior of younger people in general in the colonial economy. And colonial states tried to kind of restrict those kinds of changes. They tried to kind of close down those potential freedoms or opportunities for younger people and for women. You know, they wanted those groups to stay very much under the control of African men. And again, there's therefore an interesting alliance there between the interests of colonial officials, African male elites against African women and African younger men. Again, I'm sketching this out in very broad general terms. But again, it's a more interesting and more complex story than simply kind of Europeans against Africans. You know, it's a more varied story than that would suggest. You know, African societies are complex. They have their own kind of internal tensions over gender, over generation, you know, conflict between the older and the younger generations. Also interesting, the history of Christianity in colonial Africa, because missionaries had been present in Africa through the 19th century, but the rate of conversion to Christianity accelerated very rapidly during the early 20th century in Africa with the coming of colonialism. And so again, it's possible to see the conversion of Africans from their traditional belief systems to Christianity as a symptom of kind of cultural imperialism during the colonial period. That missionaries were functioning to some extent as the kind of cultural arm of the imperial project. Crucially, missionaries provided most of what was provided in terms of education in Africa, in colonial Africa. You know, if people went to school in Africa, they usually went to mission schools, at least in areas where missionaries were active. Colonial governments were always quite reluctant to educate people. They didn't want people to get ideas. You know, so actually it was missionaries who were doing much of this work. And again, some scholars have argued that basically this process of mission education and the conversion of Africans to Christianity was in its own way a kind of project of kind of cultural domination, where European ideas about religion and culture and education were imposed on Africans. And the image on the left there sort of suggests that way in which, you know, Africans, you know, started to dress like Europeans in mission stations when they converted. You know, they were encouraged to behave in certain ways, to organize their lives in certain ways that were kind of approved by European missionaries. But on the other hand, the story of African Christianity is a lot richer than the history of missionary activity in Africa, because again, there were actually always very few European or British missionaries who were active in Africa. Most of the work of converting Africans to Christianity was done by African evangelists, that is, people who had converted themselves and then went out basically to spread the word of God amongst their own communities and peoples. And the Christianity that was created in Africa as a result was not necessarily always the Christianity that the missionaries intended to spread. African Christianity incorporated elements of African traditional belief systems and elements of African cultural practice, traditional customs, if you want to call them that. To the extent that Africans actually set up their own breakaway churches in colonial Africa, free of missionary control. They wanted to create a version of Christianity that reflected their own culture and their own kind of preferences. Missionaries were often deeply uncomfortable about this. For instance, what do you do about Africans who convert to Christianity but still insist on having polygamous marriages? That is, men having more than one wife. Missionaries disapproved of this. African churches could take a more flexible approach to those sorts of customs, and in doing so, of course, reshaped what it meant to be a Christian in Africa. More than that, some of the independent churches that were created and some of the forms of Christianity that emerged in colonial Africa were explicitly kind of anti-colonial. So on the right here, this is actually a stamp from the Congo in Central Africa, a stamp from 1987, but it commemorates the life of a man called Simon Kimbangu, as he called himself a prophet of Christ, who founded his own church in the Congo. And adherents of what became known as Kimbanguism following his leadership, following his prophetic leadership, refused to pay taxes to the colonial government, refused to provide their labor for colonial kind of economic projects. So following Christianity or following certain kinds of churches could also be a way of escaping the authority of the colonial state, of escaping the domination of the colonial state. So Christianity is really fascinating in colonial Africa because on the one hand, it looks like a European imposition brought to Africa by Europeans, imposing their kinds of spiritual worldviews and their sorts of cultural practices. But on the other hand, when you dig into it a little bit deeper, what you see is an extremely dynamic process of Africans reshaping what it means to be a Christian, and using Christianity very much for their own ends and for their own purposes, and shaping it along the lines of their own spiritual and political preferences and beliefs. So I suppose in summary, just to conclude what I've been saying, and I won't go on any longer, I suppose I've been trying to encourage you to think about imperialism in Africa as a much more kind of dynamic, interactive and unpredictable project than a simple narrative about domination and resistance would kind of suggest. In many ways, the consequences of imperialism were shaped by Africans who, as I say, kind of, shaped what that project meant at so many different levels, at an elite level, but also at a popular level with ordinary people, shaping colonial economies, shaping belief systems, and, ultimately co-producing what colonialism in Africa actually meant. And I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you very much, Christopher. I just noticed just one point before we move on to our next presentation. That stamp's in French.
Yes.
I presume French wasn't at some stage the official language of the Congo.
Yes, but it does because of colonialism, it becomes so and remains so. And again, I mean, that's, it's interesting to see all these many legacies of colonialism that remain right through to the present. It's absolutely embedded in so many ways in legal and economic structures, in terms of official languages and so on. So yeah, it's very striking to see that.
Yeah, thank you again. We're going to move on to our next presentation from a lady who's a recent graduate of Amity University. So if I can just work out how to share my screen. Well, I'm going to have to stop it because I missed out to share the audio. Share sound. There we go.
Hello everyone, my name is Blanca and I work at Amity University. I have been working at Amity University for a year now, and I studied history at King's College London. So I'm aware that most of you are doing history level, and so I'm guessing a lot of you are looking to do history at university. Hopefully some of you are thinking about it. So I have created this presentation hoping that I can clarify what to expect from a history degree at university. What are the benefits of studying a history degree? What is it like? What to expect and what you can get out of it. So, history at A level. So what you will be doing now is looking at two different types of studies, right? You will be doing one part of it. One part of your A level will be focused on breadth study. The other part will be focused on depth study. Now, for breadth study, you study significant historical developments that have happened over a long period of time. So I'd say between 50 and 100 years. And you look at the associated interpretations of those historical developments. So for breadth study, you will be studying topics such as the age of the Crusades, Spain in the Age of Discovery, the British Empire, and then for depth study, here you're focused on in-depth study of a major historical change or a major historical development. So, such as the War of the Roses, international relations and conflicts, fascism, the Cold War. Those two last ones are the historical developments, events that I looked at during my A level, and I loved it. So, by studying these two different types of studies, the breadth and the depth study, you gain an understanding of the different identities within society, which provides you with a greater understanding of the past and also improves your critical thinking. So I think if you are considering studying a history degree at university, you need to really appreciate what history is, and this is why the name of this slide, History Beyond A Levels. I wanted to share with you how powerful and how important history is and how far it can take you in your life. So the first reason is history gives you an understanding of the past so that you can better understand the present. So to understand why society is the way it is now, why do we have the customs and traditions that we have now, and even why do we think the way we do? What have we done in the past to lead us to where we are now? So if you think, for example, about the protests that have been happening lately about climate change, well, that happened a year ago, but still happening in some of the countries. So protests to do with the environment, with Black Lives Matter, LGBT, history, and learning about the past really helps you understand why are these events happening, why is this why are we suddenly changing so much, and why are we going in the direction that we're going to? So it's incredibly useful to know history, and that's why I think a history degree is very valuable. Or for example, even thinking about China and being communist. History helps you understand, okay, why is China the way it is today? Where does communism even come from? How did it come about? How did China, and why did China become communist? History really helps you understand cultures and countries and how people think and how they work. And then the second reason is that history gives you the opportunity to acquire and to improve on many of the key skills that have been identified as a high priority, for higher education after consultation with employers. And I can assure you from experience that no matter what job you apply to, employers will ask you if you have the skills that I will talk about in a second, required for the job. And these skills are skills that, believe it or not, you gain from a history level degree. And then lastly, having a history degree opens the door to many different career paths. And this might sound surprising because when you think of history, at least when I thought of a history degree, the first thing I thought was a history teacher. What else can I do? But actually, there's so many different career paths, so many opportunities that you can have from having such a degree. And I will speak about this on the next slide. So, why study a history degree at university? First reason, because it will help you make a future impact no matter where you are and no matter what kind of job you get. Because when you study history, you learn from the past, you learn the mistakes that were made in the past so that you can avoid making them in the future. Also, because you gain such valuable skills, as I have already mentioned, skills that you need in order to be successful in your future jobs. So if you want to make a future impact in whatever job you have, you will need these skills. If, for example, you want to become a lawyer, if you want to be a successful lawyer, you will need to construct strong, unbelievable arguments. You will need to know how to communicate effectively, how to analyze information, how to convince people. All these skills that you gain from a history degree. So it will help you be successful in your career. Now, also, as I mentioned before, a history degree opens the door to many different career paths. So the ones I have listed here are careers such as an archaeologist, a gallery curator, or even working for the government, being a member of parliament, or a police officer. And this last one might sound surprising because you might be thinking, what does a police officer have to do with history? Or even you can even go to the business industry if you decide to become a marketing executive, for example. How can you be a successful marketer with a history degree? Well, it's quite useful to have a history degree if you want to become a marketer, because a history degree, as I mentioned before, helps you understand people, understand cultures, why people act the way they do, and it helps you communicate effectively. You need these abilities in order to build a successful marketing campaign. So again, it promises success in your career. Or you can even become a journalist, or such as a broadcast journalist. So I have just talked to you about why you should do a history degree, but now I want to talk to you about the value of having a history degree. How do you really benefit from it? And I'd say that the biggest benefit that you can get from studying a history degree is the skills you get from that. Because as I mentioned earlier on in this presentation, the skills that you get from this degree will be crucial for whatever work, whatever job you apply to. And I remember when I was applying for jobs, Employers would always ask me at least 2 of the skills that I have listed here. The most popular ones were analytical skills and problem-solving skills. So I promise you that a history degree strengthens these skills a lot, more than other degrees out there. So what skills do you get from a history degree? Well, first of all, you get analytical skills and reasoning. You get research skills, being able to select what information is valuable, what information is useless. Critical thinking, problem solving, creativity. These skills help you organize information and communicate effectively. It helps you build strong, convincing arguments. And for example, with regards to problem solving, history helps you develop the ability to ask the relevant and the significant questions when doing your research, and when exploring different alternatives, when looking at different interpretations of historians. It also helps you make links between the different research that you find. Okay, so for my final part of this presentation, I wanted to talk to you about what to expect in a history degree. So the first thing is that every university will offer different modules and options and content. So it's worth carrying out some research beforehand and before applying to the universities that you're thinking of applying, because every university will be different. So it really depends on what years of history you're interested in, or what countries you're interested in. And also, most universities will offer a year abroad. Some will even offer internships. I remember at King's we had the choice of doing an internship. So really look at what each university offers, because if you are interested in having a year abroad during your degree, and I highly recommend doing a year abroad, then ensure that you apply to a university that offers that. But you can, however, expect to learn the following subjects, the following history subjects at uni. So first one is the European and world history, the Middle East, Britain and the movies, Greek history, the Odyssey, and, as I said before, a year abroad. Most universities offer a year abroad, but just watch out because some might not. So just so you know. And I just wanted to let you know about the structure of the degree. So during the first year, you're focused more on introductory modules that help you build an understanding of the background of historical events. And then when you get to your second year, that's when you can start choosing the modules that you are interested in. So that's where you can start to personalize the degree to what you like, what you would like to focus on, if you want to focus on narrower times. And then on your third year, you start working on your dissertation. So yes, I really hope that you found this presentation useful, and that hopefully it has helped you decide whether or not you would like to study a history degree. And if so, I wish you the best of luck. Also, if you decide to study something else, I wish you the best of luck with everything and with your future. Thank you.
Hopefully Christopher's still there with us, and we might have time for a couple of questions. I just wanted to pick up on maybe a couple of things from the last presentation, seeing as we've got your expertise here with us today. And one, there's that thing about the curriculum varying from university to university. So, I mean, do all universities offer the same core modules, or can even those differ?
No, I mean, it's really varied. I mean, it's just completely unpredictable, because universities have complete independence on how they set their curriculum. So it's just whatever the whatever particular university wants to do and organize its structures. I think it's really worth students looking carefully. I mean, this kind of sounds obvious, but it's really important. Look carefully at what particular courses are offering. As a good example, our place at John Moores, we basically are doing 19th and 20th century history. Yeah, so we're doing British, European, and wider world history in those periods. But we're not doing medieval history. We're not doing early modern history. So if you want to do the Tudors, we can't help. If you want to do the Crusades, we can't help. But if you're interested in the sort of making of the modern world, then it's a great degree course, right? Other places will offer different periods. So University of Liverpool, for instance, up the road has, medieval and early modern history. They have a particular interest in cultural history, which might be particularly good for some people. So it's sort of important to understand what those differences are. I think it's really crucial that you kind of make sure that you're going to a course where your particular interests are going to be kind of met. And I mean, also the range of choice will vary a great deal as
absolutely.
Well. In terms of, Sorry, go on. I just wanted
that's down to often the academic, isn't it?
Yeah.
That it will vary according to what the academics specialize in. Because at university, you're taught by people who are actively researching their subject, and they will draw upon those research interests to inform the curriculum.
Exactly.
And I mean, another question, I suppose, archaeology was mentioned there, and we were talking before we went live, saying that maybe a history degree wouldn't necessarily be the best route into archaeology. There are specific archaeology degrees out there. But I suppose one of the things from the presentation that did come over is the broad range of careers you can go into with a history degree. So I think there's about 50% of graduates go into jobs which are totally unrelated to their actual degree subject. But so what do you feel, Christopher, makes a good history student?
I think what makes a good history student is what makes a good employee, a good graduate employee, right? It's the same qualities, and that's why there is that fit. So it's about independence, organization, self-motivation. I suppose what's different is that there's less emphasis perhaps on team working during an academic degree than when you move into the kind of the real world, as it were. But there is also teamwork kind of built into many degree courses. Ours has a sort of group project element, for instance. But it's kind of, everybody always talks about resilience as well. Now, this is a kind of key buzzword, isn't it, in the ether? Everybody wants everybody to be resilient, and I think a degree in history is very much a kind of exercise in resilience. Like you kind of, you're working with the support of your tutors and the support of your fellow students, but you're also drawing a lot on your own kind of your own energy, your own organizational capacity, your own kind of interest to drive things forward. And I think also communication skills are really, really important as well. Obviously, for a history degree, the ability to communicate clearly in writing and also verbally, to communicate your points, to persuade the audience. When you write a history essay, it's an exercise in persuasion as much as anything else. So effective communication, persuasive communication is really important. And again, that's really important for so many careers and, in so many different sectors. So I think, there's a range of strengths and skills that we develop during the course of a history degree with our students, and that help them to kind of make that transfer to a professional graduate sort of level role.
And what made you choose history as your degree subject?
That was my own interest, and I think that's where we're often fortunate as lecturers and as teachers, that we're teaching students who have chosen the subject because they like it. They have a sort of built-in motivation to engage with the subject, which makes teaching it much more rewarding, and also means that they often achieve well as well. They do well because they're interested, because they're engaged. And I do always say to people, you should only do a degree subject that you're actually interested in, because it's a heck of a lot of work. You need to motivate yourself, as I was saying, for 3 years. And it can be very difficult to maintain that motivation if you're not actually interested in the subject that you're doing. So the best argument for doing a history degree is because it's your favorite subject, because you actually like it more than anything else. And, if that's the case, then you'll probably do better in a degree in history than you will do in anything else for that same, because of that same logic.
Okay, that's great. Well, we're very grateful for your time this afternoon, Christopher. Thank you very much for joining us. And I hope all our viewers have